Oh, yes. So now, should we say now? There's a verse which is quoted from Scripture, but it's in the commentary on the Introduction to the Middle Way, the commentary by Master Chandrakirti. And there it says that the self is the mind of Mara, is the Mara mind. Mara is like the devil or demon. And that from that Mara mind of Mara, comes all of the evil views. And out of those evil views then arise all of the different kinds of problems, suffering and so forth that are experienced throughout samsara. And just as that verse suggests, the same thing is said by Master Shantideva in the introduction to the Bodhisattva's conduct. And there it says that the wrong view of the self is the root of all of the various forms of misconceptions that arise, and then out of those misconceptions arise all of the other mental afflictions of attraction and aversion, desire, hatred, and so forth. And then from all of those mental afflictions arise all of the sufferings, the hardships, difficulties that we experience throughout samsaric existence. And so in the first verse, that's not explicitly stated. It just says that the beginning of that verse anyway says that the Mara mind is self. The idea of self is the Mara mind, so the mind of Mara, the demon or devil, and out of that come all of the wrong views. So what that shows is that once we have as an object, or the fictitious notion of self, which holds the self to exist in some kind of intrinsic or autonomous fashion, then once that object occurs and we apprehend it as if it were real, as if there was a real self, then that serves as the foundation. That is the ignorance which functions as the basis for all of the other factors of dependent origination that produce the entirety of samsaric existence. And so, like in Master Shantideva says in the introduction to the Bodhisattva's conduct, he says that he said at the end of his verses that you, O demon, given that demon Mara has afflicted us beginninglessly, self and others beginninglessly, what should I do to that demon? That's what he says.
Oh yeah, 다 가서 동아 탐색에 싸워 용사대 당진랑 요와대 준주고 다시 가로 지단단을 차와 강요도 세체 아니 대면이 봐 아니 대다유를 진짜 다 줘봐 네비 소라 피비 주치고 나기니랑 완내잖아 코와지면 가와 칼라 주로 제리가나 다 통마 매반나 아니라라 양라 비는 내디 아니 이 맞아 봤다 자체가 됐다 당진 나도 제가 당진이 봐 대다유를 진짜 자주 아니 드라추바 당진이 여봐 인자 될 때는 아니 차다 모순치 차다 모순 거 관계 아니 다 거기 가서 선언만 빌려 봐도 봤을 동안 연구지요 연구와 인자 네비 서로 비비주 딱이니랑 와 내잖아 코와지면 가와 칼라 주로 시시송 나시 전에 시시 당진 그 상황 저서 마송와 상황 저송와 대세도 아니 동아지라실라 대비 고가까지 좀 해봐.
So Master Shantideva continues in his discussion of this, saying that enemy here, the enemy here is not an external enemy, but the internal enemy of the misapprehension of the self, grasping the self in a way it doesn't actually exist, misapprehending it. That is the root of samsara, and as long as one has that misapprehension of the self, then when all of the other mental afflictions, desire, hatred, all of the rest arise out of that, and from those then one engages in karma, which propels one through all of the different realms of existence. And so as long as one has this basic misconception of the nature of the self, then all of the rest of the mental afflictions will arise. The karma that's impelled, motivated by those mental afflictions will be created, and then one will have to necessarily experience suffering, limitless forms of suffering. There's no end to it as long as that basic misconception of the self resides within one like an inner enemy. Then as long as that is happening, then one is necessarily enmeshed in the sufferings of samsara, which is like a horrible prison in which one is being tormented. And so one should recognize it for being what it is, that samsara is not a pleasure garden, it's actually a horrible prison, and so one makes a prayer to be empowered to be able to gain that recognition of the actual nature of samsara and the root cause of it, this inner enemy of misapprehension of the self.
Oh yeah, 아니 대신도 아니 라마 다마라지다기야라 대달라면 더 다그신 잠나를 총근 잡듯이 가서 또 아니 가서 다들 좀 와서 대달라가 또 잠나를 총총을 No, that's the song. That live and draw, dark is a general chungun dark sense. That can't take the drama so they or that draw one of the careers and or gasore dancing maripa. Or thinking that I live and draw dark is general or general chungun dark is around the Zina Louis, Danny, Gamma, dancing the cheese, and dancing the Tussle Mays, around a pamper to Yaki, and Luni bear. Pamper to be with such a Luni, and it take his I want to song, and it or castle that one about me about the Jungoidan, Teta Love and draw darkest, and general Louis, chungun darkest. Around the Zina Louis, dancing, Jenny, Gamma dancing the Tussle Mays. How was that?
So now there's another verse that says this, it makes the same point in different words from Master Dharmakirti, and he says that this misapprehension of the self is it's like a secret, stealthy enemy. This enemy isn't obvious to us. It's not something that when we occurs for us, we don't recognize it as an enemy, but rather it's like a stealthy enemy that sneaks up on us and causes us all kinds of problems without us being recognizing it for what it is. Or it's like a robber who comes again secretly and steals away all of our property or possessions without us knowing about it. And that being the case, then one needs to recognize this misapprehension of the self as like that secret enemy or a secret robber that is taking away all of our well-being and is causing us to be involved with all kinds of misery and suffering, and therefore we need to gain that recognition and thus not be deceive ourselves into thinking that this misapprehension of the self, this holding on to the self in the way we in a confused way do so, is actually beneficial to us, but recognize it as being harmful.
Oh yeah, that ten times he said, Kidu Yeji, Lenny, Shan Samyang, Genzarala, the Tirua, Chinese Song, I see Jenny, Tarala, Kibodang, and the Dubo Yoyaki, and the Zawa de Kawali Yoris, and the Raleigh Yoris. Lenny Shella Diagram, Maris, Soso Setumadi, Shanji could take you watch it, there was the Shanji to take you what intended Mayimba, Lenny Shella Dasa Yo Maris. Or Lenny Dasa the Carriers and Ranga Yoris. She said, Dasan, didn't the want to song change a lot of Deva Numaji let Deva Meba. That changing Chona and Deva Pashima the Tonga Meba is out. What is that? Kidu Nijilia, Shan Sam Young, Genzarala, the Tirua, said that dream. Kidu Niji, Leland Shan Sam Youngs. Because Kiboji mission, but you could take you what you do. Dumajina mission, but you get any particular with so much Manda, Lelandasat.
So that's now, as it is, up to this point, we've been controlled. We are dominated by this misapprehension of the self, this enemy residing within us, and that has controlled us. But in reality, our own control, we actually have control over our own well-being, and we create for ourselves basically our own happiness and our own misery. We have the ability to gain control over ourselves, such that we have the responsibility for our own happiness and misery. It comes down to us, and it's not the case that there's some external agent, some person outside of ourselves that is able to either harm us or help us. Ultimately, there's no external person that is the ultimate source of our happiness or suffering, but rather this is something that comes from within us in terms of our own gaining control or lack of control of our own activities, our karma, and as well as our understanding of the way we actually exist. So the continuation of this verse says that the actual responsibility for where our happiness and suffering comes from is not external to ourselves, it's within ourselves.
오야 다 된저 인상 안에 다 진정기 샤원도 소만로라 라려와 인상 안에 당진 도와 셰발라 안에 다 당진지기 센시 안에 신유에 받다라 보고와 인상 안다 진진나네 다제샤와 뒤시天天到了就把人当真的当然是안에 과샤원提问个안에 당연就样子弄嘛的现呢理解了的当真都不考试了帮这个人不考的人谁干了안에都是碰不对的给了什么学chế度其他人老错那么了当然行的绝吧的执行碰不那的那工作什么学chế度这里他都算一把的是吧现在人上안에 되게 가서 도저히 품보 뒤통데 세가나 안에 최이 담에 때 안에 제가 섬전学제도 세가나 안에 최이 담에 가사 그 담에 때도 송어에 말에 와我인상 안에 품 가서래 다시 품보를 하시지 맞추바당 안에 가사를 하시 말고 가사 생각에 안에 가사 가지 가면 좋아 나시 전에 다시 품보 초발할 때는 따바잠마도 어려운거 매봐 당신 대기 다시 품보라 따바 많이 봐 어려운거 해봐 줘봐 zem바라 아니 나 가사 세가 다시 품보라 때는 따바 잠도 따바 잠도 해봐 이라 아니 가사 뒤에 품보 뒤통데 세가 어려운도 주에 똥봐甚至라완도 주베 동안 풍보야 라완도 주베 동안 가사야 라완도 주베 담바 랑이 다시를 때는 따바 담아도 매바 인상 좋아 인상 아니 섬전 시자 이제 풍보 되지 내가 섬전 시제도 세계 민게 따바 담도 여봐라 아니 섬전 시죠 그래
So thus, this misapprehension of the self again is the, as was said in those verses that we quoted, is the fundamental source of all of the wrong views. The other kinds of wrong views derive from this misapprehension of the self, so thus it's again because of these other wrong views producing all of the and the fact that all of the mental afflictions arise out of that misapprehension of the self. It's the root of all misfortune that is experienced by self and others. So that being the case, then what is it that is the antidote or counteragent to the misapprehension of the self? That's explained again in the introduction to the Middle Way. Master Chandrakirti had said that the aggregates, the collection of the aggregates, based upon the collection of the aggregates, we say sentient being. We designate a collection of aggregates as a sentient being, or as a self. If we're referring to ourselves or the selves of others, we can designate it as a self. Oh, it's actually, I'm sorry, I misidentified this. It's not a verse. These verses are not coming from the introduction to the Middle Way itself. Rather, they're quoted, they're sutra, which is quoted in the commentary, Chandrakirti's auto-commentary to the introduction to the Middle Way. So the verses continue by saying that just as a cart or chariot, that thing is designated based upon the collection of the parts that make up, the collection is the basis upon which one designates a thing as a cart or a chariot. The same word is used for both things, say cart. We identify a cart based upon a collection of its parts brought together in a certain way as a basis of designation. Well, just like that, the collection of the aggregates, when they're brought together in a certain way, then based upon that collection, that composite, then we designate a sentient being or a self or I. So the process of description is exactly the same. That is, it's only when you have have that proper collection of parts in the proper arrangement, that one designates that thing as a chariot or a cart. One gives it that name. So as being designated, it's the process of designation is exactly the same as when we designate a person or a self upon the collection of the aggregates. So in both cases, in the first case is an instance of the way in which a phenomenon other than a person, in this case a cart, is designated upon its basis of designation. The cart is designated based upon its proper basis of designation. The second case illustrates the way a person or self is designated based upon its specific basis of designation, the collection of the aggregates. But the process of designation is exactly the same. And the fact that the cart or the person is designated strictly based upon a particular proper basis of designation then demonstrates both that the phenomenon of the cart or the phenomenon of the person are merely designatedly existent. That is, they only exist as designations. They don't have some kind of autonomous intrinsic character that establishes them as carts or persons apart from that process of designation. And then likewise, the collections that are the proper bases of designation for carts and persons themselves are simply collections of things, and thus the individual parts or the collection as a whole is not something that exists by means of its own intrinsic identity or has some kind of intrinsic character, autonomy that makes it what it is, but it too is just something which is designated by means of thought and language. We give the name cart to something a thing which is a collection, a composite, that is a suitable base for making that ascription of name. And the same thing occurs when we ascribe a name like a person or self to a collection of aggregates. The process of ascription is exactly the same. And in both cases, both the thing which is designated, the cart or the person, as well as the basis of designation, none of these things have any kind of autonomy or intrinsic character that makes them what they are, but rather they're simply established in that way through the process of designation itself.
Oh yeah, that's all it is.
Tēnei tākpa.
Tēnei tākpa. Te kāsa, tuji pōmpo tētēnei tēla samjian xie chi tō sē kāla. Ane, rāsīn ji chūya tōngjāng, ane kāsa sēngā te kānta chūya, te kāsa ngā shi shūwa nā xīn chāne, pōmpo rē rē wā tāng, pōmpo chōpa tāng, pōmpo īw tāng. O tā kāsa rē, tēmbā tāng, tēmbā. 다도 강아 매번 하시잖아요. 공부 초발라 때나 다바자 모두 아니 공부 때나 다바자 단 다바자 모두 라완도 자네 매봐. 공부 띵도야 매봐. 다시 풍부되면 봐. 텔라 때나 다바니지 다시 되면 봐 되고지. 중앙 줄차는 뭐보다 밀어서 다와시노 레시스 벌 레시스 벌 소하나시. 이러 가세 가제 대시 풍부 때나 주발 엄마 주발에 지금 봐. 풍부 대장 다 마치 당의 메시지 간제 두세 어디 안에다 매wan 하시 이제 뒤에 빼대라 기타 연락 초남라 때나 신다 줘봐다 지신 풍부는 내가 구조 섬제 시작 오세지 기타 연락 초봐라 세가라 신다기 아니 초봐 신다랑기 연락 신다 아니 연락 초봐 아니 달리 생긴 무서워나 신다랑기 연락다 지당 타대 아니 신다랑기 연락다 땜바당 연락 신다라 땜바 신다랑기 연락다 땜바당 연락 신다라 땜바 땜비 소니 요 신다랑기 연락다 지당 타다다 땜바당 편준 땜비 추니당 야这两个发电吧错zam당错比입대 아니我点点难度，安尼新的满也把提醒度是 어다 대나시 지가 풍보를 와서 초바다 풍비 입당 편지 땜비 투당 아니 어 텐디나네 아니 가사 명예장 아니 가사 다시 풍보를 때나 따봐 잠도 여봤다 됐은 거야 말.
So this relationship then between a thing which is designated and its basis of designation is illustrated in that sutra passage by saying that just as a cart is designated based upon the collection of the parts of the cart when it's the parts of the cart are put together in a proper configuration, then that thing is suitable as a basis for designating that thing as a cart. In exactly the same way, we say person or self or I based upon a collection of the aggregates. The collection of the aggregates brought together in the proper kind of configuration or collection is a suitable basis for designating that thing, the collection of the aggregates, as a I or a self person. And so the process of designation is exactly the same. Just as the relationship of the dependent designation of a cart upon its particular basis of designation is that relationship between the thing which is designated, the cart, and the designation, the cart, and the thing which is designated, that collection of parts. The relationship there is such that the designation, the cart, the term cart, the thought cart, what have you, is not findable in any way within the basis of designation. That is, the identity or the term cart, the thought cart, is not something which is findable when you examine its basis of designation. If you look at the basis of designation, the collection of the components that are the basis for designating that thing, then the individual parts, none of the individual parts are the cart. The collection of the parts themselves as such is not the cart, is not the cart itself, the designation cart. It's not the case that the cart possesses the basis of designation, the collection, and it's not the case that the collection possesses the designation. It's not like it's within that basis of designation. And it's not the case that the configuration of the collection of the parts itself is the cart as such. Rather, the way it is that the designation cart is merely ascribed to its basis of designation, but it is not findable within the basis of designation in any possible way, and they don't possess, it doesn't possess any kind of, there's no relationship between the basis of designation and the designation itself that would make the designation findable within its basis of designation. When you look for cart within the basis of designation, it's unfindable. There's no way to find it. Same thing applies to the relationship between the person or self or I as a designation for the collection of the aggregates. The collection of the aggregates is a suitable basis of designation, and based upon that basis of designation, one can designate a thing, a I or a self or a person. But when you search for the I or the self or the person within the basis of designation, you find that it's not findable as any of the individual aggregates. It's not findable as the collection of the aggregates. It's not findable as a possessive relationship where the collection of the aggregates possesses the I or self, and it's not the case that the I or self possesses the collection of the aggregates, and the configuration of the collection of the aggregates also is not, when one looks for the I or self, it's not findable as the configuration of the aggregates as such. So what happens then is when you look for the I or self or person within the basis of designation, the collection of the aggregates, it's not findable. It doesn't exist within its basis of designation.
Oh yeah, that then 가서래 가사 넘버 뒤에 제대로 매해 봐당 신다란 게 안에 제대로 매해 봐 배제 중에 저와 오다시 시와 나시시 아니 가사 넘버 뒤에 제대로 많이 봐대 대성도 안에 생유 되라 신다란 게 알아서 지난 태대 때마다 편준되면 초단 수니단 초장다 초비 이들 뒤로 자와 매장 랑게 알아라 때는 다외도 저와 신도 시오 랑게 신다를 랑게 알아라 때는 다외도 저와 신도 강사 대장 아니다 랑게 풍부 처발라 때는서 자위 sana 아니 넘버 뒤에 자와 많이 장 안에 풍부 처잖아 때네 안에 다외도 줘봐 집어채 줘봐서 가사다 줘봐谢와 샤라 뒤에 삼이 때마 대라도님이 타소순배 뒤고를 봤나니 안에 가사가 다 고비를 봐 쪼셔와 차대 제 오도 송어이 말이라 이라 뒤에 삼이 따와 대라도님이 타소순배 세야지 가르sun 거래서나 방사 남제 남바 뒤에 제대로 많이 밤 얘들 많이 봐야 가사 그든지 아니 라심에 비싸면다와 가사 라심에 그 싸면다와 달라도니 타수 좀봐라 고고고 아래라 지단 돈이 잠자에 돈이 또왜 사무다에 사무 돈반이 따와 잘라 코메 줘봐 라심이 뒤미 제대로 많이 봐 코랑 안 돈반이 이다 남자 남바 지제 제대로 많이 봐 동반이 인사 남자 남바 지제 제대로 많이 봐 또디 가라 동반이 또고 와라 가사 그네로 또고 와르디 가사라시메 봐 또고 말아 인사 가사라시메 봐 삼이다와 대라도니 왜 타수수 배살 딜고 주인지 보고서
yeah, it's this. So then when one does this kind of analysis of the relationship between the self or the I or the person as designation and the relationship between that designation and its basis of designation, the collection of the aggregates, there's a five-fold analysis that we went through, and then there's also a seven-fold analysis where one sees that the I or self or person as designation is not does not exist within the basis of designation as identical with it, with the basis of designation, as separate from the basis of designation, as any of the parts of the basis of designation, as possessive of the basis of designation, or possessed by the basis of designation. And there's seven parts of this that if you do that complete sevenfold analysis, and you find, as a result of that, you see that you do not find the I or self or person in any way, in any of the seven possibilities within the basis of designation. It's not findable within there. Then that not finding the I or self or person within its basis of designation is itself the non-finding of the I, self, person, the designation within the basis of designation. That entails necessarily that the I or self or person is devoid of intrinsic nature or intrinsic existence, is empty, because it necessarily depends upon its basis of designation as a designation, and therefore, since it's dependent, it can't have the kind of autonomy that intrinsic existence or intrinsic nature, existing by means of its own character and so forth, existing by means of intrinsic identity. None of these would be are possible because of the dependent relationship between the designation and its basis of designation. So that this is said, for example, in Lecture Nyingbo, the essence of good explanations, to be the most profound method for ascertaining essencelessness, the absence of intrinsic existence or intrinsic nature. And it said that it's this not finding the designation within its the basis of designation, the non-findability of the designation within the basis of designation is said to be this most profound method for developing an understanding of emptiness, and thus what one finds as a result of that, on the one hand, you find the absence, that the designation does not exist within the basis of designation in any way whatsoever, but you also find as a sort of implicit outcome of that, that the designation and the relationship between the designation and its base, or the designation itself, is merely a mental construct which is designated upon that basis of designation, but is not something that exists autonomously or from its own side in some kind of autonomous fashion.
Oh yeah, that is tenderly, and it's a Kasaka Kavachebala Kasore. Yeah, I need the Chibokasore, the Umajangana Soana, Tata Shaman with the Yanda Pani Chibata, Soana, and it's Shirowagi, Tabit, or Kanjami to be Tabit, and it's Chito, Lasavagda, Lashiri, Tabakaya, Tabatabaka, Cherabata, that was young Govenza, or Dakasanga to call or两搞不清楚了吧？是吧？是两搞不清啊。
去两年把头给热身啊！啊，的上了，的去两年把头给热身啊！可csak csomó rangsin mép la, tényleg to pe nyepa meto.
Ko csak csomó.
Csomó szó.
자와 그래 대대다면 망해지 오미다 바나나 오미다 바나나 따바죠 주면은 대충 칭어래 그래
라면티 그래서 대체 지때 대다니 되네 포모 마닝이 디 망체 첸수 디 큐양 녜파 타워 교로시나 코차
진짜 가져
디 겨다 가사 니파 니파 니페 샴나 치마손 니가 숨주
가져
니파 디 샴나 큐양 녜파 타워 교로시나 코차 중어 랑신 메라 디네 도페
날로치 말도
녜파 메토 디치마손
이제 가져라 어야 세진이 나라미 배상하 오냐 봐 제친자로 자와데 간제 중화 탐제라 포모 많이 유명 봐 지디 제다든 드네 포모 많이 미 저와도 변 대칭 자와체 내가 광한 예 맞서다든다
Kiedy niszki, szamla, kilayan niepa tower geroshena.
Dede 장가 가서래디 자와디 이자.
저 니가 니슈 잡든. 니가 니슈 잡든야 니파.
이자 니슈 잔이. 화이 그래 말이.
말이. There's one line that we didn't go over in the
장가디 가져래세 디 슈구장가.
슈구장가 니가 숨주. 니가
숨주래. 니가 숨주고 다 가래세.
디 샴라. 디 찍ting chick.
코어제 중화랑 심해 발라다 도반이 엄을시. 다 대샤. 야매도 어세체 나 숨바 현지 달라면은 어우년 빌로 제르 바타와니 현지 달라면은 어우년 빌로 제르 바타와니 최제 다강 아다마이 대대다면 망해시 오메다 바나라 또바제와 주면은 세대다 데레 어디레 대가자 나라면은 어우년 바기 다 베는 지다기 아니 나라면은 어우년 바기 아니 나라시 주와 지거와 어디라 나라면은 어우년 바 제르 바타와니 최진 다강 아다민 대대다면 망해시 오메다 바나라 또바제와 주면은 좋아 가사긴다 랑경 원이지 마주와타 가사겠다 랑경 원이지 마주와타 대중나 세진기 아니 세진기 따라 최진기 미비 세나야 어원이 뭐 그래스 아니 가서 그래. 당 오니 그 태지게 다 오니지 주나 아니 태지게 다 있어야 돼. 강라야 맞대봐 인자 최진경아 대야 내진경아 인고 태진경아 대야 최진경아 인고와 인자 아니 태진경아라면야 최진경아 오냐 최진경아 오냐 불러 지그랬어야 되라. 가서 당 오니지 맞주바 타 대중앙 동 오니지 주나 태진지 다라 최진지 미비 천나야 대라오 오냐 불러 지거와라 태매비세 최지 다 강인 바태 내다 많이 바태나 해진게 다 강인 바태 아니 최지 다 많이 바태나 야나 최지 다 강인 바태 내다 많이 바태나 최지 안진게 요데 랑근 오에 다 많이 바타 다 소소 내와 인상 랑근 오에 다이나 아니 해진가 최진가 연구와 인자 대만이 인자 최지 다 강인 바다 많이 바태나 최근 안정의 유대란 건 오해 주에 당 많이 받다. 코자의 안정의 유당 다도 차비 유도 코자의 안정의 유당 다도 차비 유투 다도 차비 유투만 내비셔야.
So next comes a rejection of the idea that and reasoning that shows that an absurd consequence that would arise based upon the position that's held by others. Here, this is referring to the view of the Samkhya and Vaisheshikas and other Tirthaka non-Buddhist schools that posit an absolute self or eternal self, permanent self. And if their view was the case, then the absurd consequence would occur that it would be appropriate to think I when one observes someone else's self. And so this is given in verse 228, which says, it follows that the personal self is not established by means of its own, by way of its own character. That's she's translating entity, but I'm translating that as character. It follows that the personal self is not established by way of its own character. If it were, just as the thought blue arises universally in relation to blue, she pulled that out lower in the commentary, the thought I should arise in Yajnadatta when he observes Devadatta's self, but it does not. She has Yajna, but she missed the Datta there. It should be Yajnadatta. Then the thought I would arise in Yajnadatta when he observes Devadatta's self, but it does not. And the verse here says, your self is not myself, and thus there is no such self, since it is not ascertained. Does the conception not arise in relation to impermanent things? And then the commentary continues, since that which is your self is not myself, it follows that the object of your conception of I is not a self existing by way of its own character, because it is not ascertained as the object of my conception of I or my attachment to the self.
Oh yeah, 방금寫되나? 오버로 투몽 거 좋아하시노 세가나 아니 다 임바데 해진기 다당 추진기 다 니가 다 임바고 제기래와 제나양 제기래서 오버로 아니 가서래 오버로 투몽 거 오버로 좋아하시노 세라 오버 타다바니라 오버 투몽 거 좋아하시노 되나? 오버 미다 바라 소위 매제 라시 매바 남라 오버 미다 바나라 또바께와 주면은 세대라 대나 오버 미다 바라 소위 매제 라시 매바나라 오냐 베또바께와 많이 남데 대라 아니 오냐 베또바께와 좋아 많이 남데 때나다와 코나오 세라 때나다와 코나 대나 오냐 베또바께가 말해서 오 미다 바라 아니 나 가나다 베 다시 온 거 말아 미다 바라 안 진짜
So then the example that's used to illustrate that, which Ruth gave earlier, just as the thought blue arises universally in relation to blue, if two people see a patch of blue, they both think blue. Well, if the self is established by means of its own intrinsic character, then when I see someone else's self, I would think myself, and vice versa. That absurd consequence would obtain. So, and then the conclusion here is, therefore, isn't it the case, the question is posed, that it's with respect to impermanent things, impermanent functional things such as physical things, etc., which have the names, we call these things, physical physical colors and shapes and sounds and so forth, that, and these things are devoid of intrinsic nature, and with respect to them, it's with respect to these things that we think I. We observe impermanent things of our aggregates, and then we think I. Based upon that, isn't that the case? And it's thus the I is strictly dependently designated.
Oh yeah. Then you do check about Tella. Do check about Tella. That about what you do doing about Gaba. Luguji in Bagaba. That be to check Gaba. That's whom you've been in it. That about what you do doing about Gaba Tella. 这段叫的就你旅行那么远就是出几天了旅来先你当你没得少谁干了我得说的你当你没得少你当你没得少这几天了旅来先你当你没得少大把要把的他考完就过来是那就是考完就把当多把要把人考完就把当多把要把人上俺大把要的大把也都考完就把当多把要些那么呢俺呢熟悉来山呢考俺考完当来山呢俺呢来就俺呢见你考完当俺呢熟悉俺呢当面过来俺呢考了他不是出的在那大约多些呢呀
So then next comes a rejection of the evidence that these non-Buddhist philosophers adduce in favor of their position of a permanent self. Here, there's first of all a rejection of the idea that permanent self could serve as the cause for the development or the stoppage of samsara. That's the first point. And then there's later the two following rejections will come. So first comes the rejection or negation of the idea that a permanent self could function as the cause for the development or reversal of samsara, the production of samsara, or the reversal of it. And that's given in the verse 229. Here, the other position, philosophers would say, the self is permanent because of being the one that enters into and leaves samsara, or being the one that causes the development and the stoppage of samsara. If there were no self, who would be in samsara due to their accumulating karma, their accumulation of karma? Who would gain freedom from samsara? Thus the self exists, that's their position. The reply to that is, from one rebirth to another, the person changes like the body. It is illogical for years to be separate from the body and permanent.
Oh yeah, 对了，对呢，出去就我们看啥的，大的，就贴了驴来在线你当，俺那大把你都要把这个骂的是吧？没人把看的人是呢，这单叫的就不你旅行那么中啊就如是的，这单叫我旅行那么他说他的没了所谓叫我当，俺那叫的就不你旅行都住呢，那么现在住啊这是。 류 현도 주네 나바 현도 주와 따바이나 아니 가르 류젠지 배 가서래 주와 매바지요 거와래 사람 밀어서 와도 겨와단 겨워기 겨와단 겨워래 겨우니 류 현도 주시 주와 신 안나바 주와 나바 주와 주시 세대라 류신 나바 주와 주르 세템바래
So then the reply to that again is that it is illogical for yourself to be separate from the body and permanent in the way that you're positing it. It follows that it is illogical for the self you assert to be permanent and a separate, she has entity here, but I think substance is better for that, a separate substance from the body because the person, like the body, changes from one rebirth as a god, human, and so forth to another, meaning that the body undergoes change from birth to birth, and thus the person, the self that is asserted by these non-Buddhist philosophers as being permanent, would necessarily have to undergo change like the bodies of the beings that undergo from life to life.
류네 사람을 깨워당 깨워는 류현도 주의 칠 안에다 따반이 되어 봐 말이 세 류의 세션이다 따반이 되어 봐 미소 스두체 아니와 류고제 임바 가봐 되라 뭐다 다 따발라 내가 담바 니 연이 담보니我在了，日当每天我了过写下，安尼没这的，特意里呢要完了送的吃吧不就了噻。大的呢，看在大门呢，安尼旅估计没白，安尼旅计要话用过嘛的是旅要话当，旅估计叫话用过嘛的是旅计要话，安尼讲公说是没准呐，是旅计要话讲公说是没准呐。新的估计就太简单了，新的短个么估计给太简单，路估计就按那个吃法给就不要的，是吧？呀。
So next comes a rejection of the idea that that the self, this supposedly permanent self, is the agent that moves the body or makes the body do things, and that is the actual rejection of it, and then a demonstration of the faults that it would obtain with respect to there being a permanent self. This is given in verse 230. The opponent here asserts that without a self there would be no physical movements such as stretching or flexing because the body would lack an activator or agent that makes it do things. Thus an inner agential person, a person that is functioning as the agent, exists who activates the body just as Devadatta drives his chariot. And so the verse here says that that's not the case. Intangible things do not produce so-called motility. Thus, the life force is not the agent of the body's movements.
Oh yeah, that's it. You the show miride se teji liji yawala soni shapapo menjuru saide miride liji yawala cheni soni kuwa chapate chapapo menjuwata yugo mares. menji ba kare sana rijada miten bisir rijada miten rijada miten bisir rijada madena ani soko chaba bo menju wa kare re sinda ni ribada da ba khone kuwa che sinda yo chaba la rijada da ba khone kuwa che ani rijada miten ba sinda kuwa me ba na sin ribada miten ba go le ani sujen ne shendu 我说过学校没这个嘛的，是的啦。我在那告诉过学校没这的，是听嘛的。
So the reply to that is that this is illogical. Your claim that the self is like it's a chariot driver and the body and so forth is like the chariot, and the reason for that is it would follow that your life force prana here or self is not the prana, the life force is not the instigator of physical movement because the self is not tangible, meaning something that's touchable or tactile, something that can be touched the way prana life force is, and this is the case because just as a chariot can only be moved by something that is tangible and not by something that is intangible, an intangible functional thing cannot actually move that which is physical from one place to another.
Oh yeah,
so the Vaisheshikas say that the self is physical, but they do not accept that it has external tangibility and so forth. There's a difference in their position from some of the others, like the Samkhyas, or not the Samkhyas, but some other non-Buddhist philosophers.
미세와단 다다반 딜레군이 지였담 남바군도 신신래 신심불래서면 도체송자 민주로 어제기 아니 가제 다다바이나 아니 당한줄라 조에 내가 소유태도 미세와 쉬었단 바탕 다바이나 안줄라 조에 안줄라 소야라 아니 내비스도 안줄 제네 동안 빠던 반영화대 아니 내가 내가 대달라 소유태도 아니 미세와 세가나 현라 미세와 공조 공조 방바 나마 미세와 세가 나마 미세와 당 쉬었단 바탕 현라 나마 미세 다다바딜라 민가의 균이 아니 균이 시유대 냐마 가와 타스 다발의 균이 잡아 주바가와 어디서 당월라 수장의 민의시 다병어월라 수장의 민의시 미세와다 다바 텔라 균이 지유탐 Pena nebi toba maybe never get up and run never you are get up Mengi and Zaji Dogenis. Number Kindu and a shingy symbol like Sunja Mijuros. Or number Kindu and shingy symbol like Sunja Mijuti soon will go on Ashere. Shingy symbol Sunja Mijuti say soon will go on Ashere.
So next comes additional problems that would exist if there was a real self, a permanent self, in demonstration of the incoherent consequences that would obtain for that. This is given in verse 231. Why teach about nonviolence and wonder about conditions for a permanent self? A diamond never has to be protected against woodworm. If it follows that if the self is permanent, it is contradictory to teach nonviolence as a practice to protect it from dangers such as bad rebirth, or to wonder what conditions are not unfavorable to it, because nothing can harm a permanent functional thing, if there was such a thing, just as a diamond which is not in danger of harm is never protected against woodworms, nor does it need to be.
Oh yeah. 무엇이노 스타 다수바 다다바 그 주체 가바텔라 제와 참바 통에 다다비 주체 미루마다 세메 뱀뱀비 제와 참바 미다바다 로라 소요연데 아니 연데나 데베 제와 참나 미다바 타와오 사지자 다 담보 제와 참베 다다비 주체 미루마니 다다비 주체 미루마니 제가 참바 유배시 가지 최지 다다나 언제 봐이 마통나 유지 최지流고 집니다 다고 다다바 임발 때 가래에서는 제가 참바 유배시랬어 누지 제마타도疾病 안전에 안에 새로 신 참바 미루소 신나 아니 누지 제마타도疾病 안전라 새로 신 참바 미루소 신나 다시 고제왕 아마라 미치도 냠발라 소비 아니 제와 참바 유시르세 제왕 아마 아니 다 뒤쟁 어라니 줄소 하나세 제왕 어라니 줄도 소하나세 제니 아니 고제왕 아마라 미치도 냠발라 소비 제와 참바 유시르 아니 가지 취지 다고 냠도 세나 아니 ngaji chamba jawa ngama chamba yinba dane data ba yinyam to semna 교황아마 류라 마소 동이 멤버 통네스 마 소도이 멤버 통네 우리 체위 마단 대위 멤버 통에 교황아마라 마체위 멤버 디노스 마체 멤버 디노스 통위지 최지리 아니 리데 미다바타와 미다바데 아니 타바타로스
So next comes the rejection of evidence that the non-Buddhist philosophers adduce to support their contention of a permanent self. It's got three subdivisions, showing that their evidence is unsuitable, the evidence of that there would be a permanent self because they claim that because we see cases of recollection of previous lives, they use that as evidence for a permanent self. It's not suitable evidence for that. And then there are other arguments that will follow, but this is the first one, showing that the proof or evidence that they give for there being a permanent self because one observes cases of memory of previous lives. That's given in verse 232. And here the verse reads, or here the assertion of the opponent is, the self is permanent because there is memory of previous births, rebirths. Memory of other lives is not feasible for a composite thing whose nature is to disintegrate as soon as it is produced. And then the reply is given in the verse initially. If your self is permanent because of remembering other lives, how can your body be impermanent when you see a scar previously formed? And then you may consider the self permanent because there is memory of past lives, thinking, I was a human in my last rebirth. You might have that memory. Then how could your body be permanent? It should be permanent because, and here she says in a past life, but I read this as earlier in your life, your current life. You saw the scar of a wound inflicted on your body earlier in your, because earlier in your life you saw the scar of a wound inflicted on your body, and now when you see, and here it should be scar, I don't know how she got birthmark out of that, but anyway, which resembles that previously inflicted wound, you say, that is the scar of the wound inflicted earlier in my life. According to, so that's the way that reads. If you observe a scar now, and that causes recollection of the wound that was inflicted on your body earlier in your life, that's the analogy that's being employed here to counteract the contention that recollection of a former life is evidence for a permanent self. So it says, according to us, the object of the thought I follows both the self of the past and this life. I'm modifying the translation here again. The thought I, it follows both the self of the past and of this life.
Oh yeah. 但今天开始，国家他就不单了，是吧？我年比我年比我的谁干了？特别呢，黑金金啊，黑金给举金啊，是吧？我是呢，黑金给举金啊是呢，你叫我们的干去，叫我们黑金给啊是呢。 黑金给我年比我们黑金给我的，叫我们的起码他们家来差不多就过的，是吧？我大半年呢也叫我他妈妈这么特别捐我妈的，是吧？哦，黑金给我的，叫我去他们家来差不多就吧，是吧？黑金叫我们能抵红，今年起码做我噻，跟黑金的可是黑金给我的，我这是我的，哦，黑金当黑金给叫我们买。 叫我起码买张，开心跟我的，叫我去他们家来，他们家就把一张，你叫我起码买这个钱，你看说，捐买吧的，电脑大把，咱们就设备， 가서 말해 나오냐면 요 나한테 나오냐면 하나 제와그 나 해진가 나한테 제왕아마다 체증 아니가 다 제수 조신 아니 때나 다바tam도 세베 때나 다바tam 마도 라완도 매바 인자 라완도에나 콜라 뒤다도 요거와 인자 아니 라완도 매바 때나 다바tam도 세베 아니 제와 참바 미다비 끼어 버려 제와 참바 태그래 라 배나 쇼이 컴비나나 쇼이네 쇼네 컴비나나 내와라 티가라 아니 자도 che마보 요비 띵나 내위 내위 띵나 내위 푸른기 아니 푸른게 강제대 미매지 강바티 슈바 멤버 나시 아니 땡주라 시지 매발라 제제탑에 타바이노 야
Again, the Lejinging,
Sana, and it going at Tamtela touch it too. Hejing, Sana, Lejinging, Sana, and it said each other the chart of what.
So now then, in our view, this is referring here to the Prasangika position, the I, which is the object of the thought, I am, that follows in both former lives and in this life. That is, it subsumes or covers both the I in the former life and the I in the present life. So the way we can illustrate this is in the case of Devadatta. Devadatta in the current life, there's a sense of the I which pervades or covers both Devadatta's former lives as well as his current life. And so the I, which is the object of the thought I am for Devadatta in the current life, subsumes or covers the I in the previous life as well. However, you cannot say that the I in the previous life and the I in the present life are identical. One has to distinguish the two I's. The current life's I and the former life's I are not identical, but the I, which is the object which gives rise to the notion of I in the present life, is the same I which gives rise to the notion of I in the former life. And so here then one can say that there's a I'll leave it at that. And so the I which gives rise to the thought, which is the object that gives rise to the thought I am, covers both the former life and the present life, the I's that exist within the former life and the present life. And because that I is simply a dependent designation, it's exhaustively a mere dependent designation, then the recollection of former lives is demonstrable and acceptable. And then the example that's given to illustrate this, there is a bowl of curd in a house. The footprint of a pale-colored pigeon perched on the thick thatch is visible on the bowl of curd, on the curd, even though its foot has not touched the curd, and so forth. Similarly, all actions and agents are feasible for that which arises dependently without intrinsic existence. She didn't translate that line. It may not have been present in her edition of the text, but in our edition of the text, it says that agents and actions are feasible for that which arises dependently without intrinsic existence.
Oh yeah. That did it. I did not see me bala. Then you don't see me bala. Charge it up the table, you know. Then you were semi pembe. Go at him, Midambani, Somebody and Dan Tatan. Kadisha Yena, Kay Somebody and Samba. Mishi Jawan Dami Jurus. That Dagi Jawa Chamba Midabata, Semi Pambo Kala Bishir, started Semi Pambo Kala Bishir. G. December than Dembe, Jawa Chamba Kalamaya, Semdan Dambedang, and the Jawa Chambaya Kalam Miride. Not Chemi Yimbala, Chi Chambadan Damba, and a Rango Oyotan Juichero, Rango Chi Chemi Yimbala, Chi Chambadan Damba, Rango Otan Juichero. Leader, Rango Jitan Jutida, La Pambo Yang. Sembadan Dembe, Semba Jendan Dembe Jan, Dani Kadi, Gawangama, so Shiabu Yinas, Pambo Yin, Da Pambo Yang, and Sembadan Semba Jendan Dembe Jan, Dani Kadi, and Gawangama, so Shiabu Yina, Tendervi. 本身提原天十八件，盘不多啊，大大点不起。安尼他说的十八件盘不他有捐我的，十八件明星盘不他有捐我的，
So next comes a rejection of the idea that it's a material thing, that mindless matter would be able to produce recollection of previous lives, showing how that's not feasible or unacceptable. So it follows that the self, here this is someone who asserts that the self is mindless matter. It follows that the self cannot remember past rebirths because it is asserted by the opponent to be mindless matter. It is also unreasonable to assert that it remembers past lives by virtue of having mind, because by first lacking memory and later possessing memory, it has given up its character or nature in the process. She has entity, I would translate that as character or its basic nature. And then verse 233 shows the verse that shows this. If the self, when possessing that which has mind, is a knower, by the same argument, that which has mind would be mindless, and the person, and she says has it permanent, but the text reads would not be permanent and not permanent. So I don't know why she has that. Anyway, if the self, despite being matter, is a knower of the past, because of possessing that which has mind, by the same argument, the attribute, that which has mind, should be mindless, and matter, because of possessing a self, which is classified as matter. So she gives a note explaining what's going on there. It follows that the self is not permanent, because first it does not remember, but later newly develops memory of past lives.
Oh yeah, that can say. 三八件全部掏多钱，就大半样民主啊，他俺的马站把他提成把啥都叫我全部写的是，然后大半那提成把啥都叫我，俺你要用我马的是，
So if the self, whether it's material or not, was permanent, then it couldn't, it wouldn't be able to remember any kind of previous lives because, or anything previous, even in a present life, because it would not have, at times it would not have memory, and then later it couldn't have memory if it was permanent in the sense of unchanging.
Ani chowa dunga nyawa, dunga nyawa la sowa ki, ani nagam na so tongko we, teji dewa la sowa, shindu date takpa nidu mirungo.
Next shows that how that it would obtain if the self was permanent, then because the self would possesses qualities such as, here there's a technical term, intellect, etc., in the Samkhya system, the Purusha or self or person, well, actually the Prakriti or basic nature that gives rise to all of the phenomena possesses qualities such as this intellect, etc. And if because of possessing those qualities, it's able to recall former lives, then it would necessarily be impermanent. So that implication is being pushed onto the opponent here. So here, verse 234, it says a life force. This is the word underlying that is prana, which is like the living force, which has, or so it could be anyway, which has pleasure and so forth, appears various as pleasure and so forth. Thus, like pleasure, it is not suitable to be something permanent. And then the commentary here, it says, if the life force or self has mind because of having attributes like intelligence, then because of having attributes like pleasure and pain, it should appear as different as pleasure and so forth, while experiencing satisfaction, and she has affliction or misery, contentment and misery. Thus, like pleasure and so forth, it cannot be permanent either. So the self cannot be permanent either. So just the self, if the self undergoes occasions or periods of satisfaction or pleasure, and then it other times undergoes periods of affliction or misery, if it's just as we observe with respect to ourselves and others, these different periods of portions of our lives or periods within our lives, then that being the case, just like happiness and suffering, etc., are occasional, they don't occur all the time, then if the self experiences those things, regardless of what medium it experiences them through, even if it's through the intellect or through the life force or whatever, if these occasions within the self are they're modified and change over time, then just as pleasure and pain are transitory and vary in their duration and occur at different times, then the self as well would have to be like that, and therefore couldn't be permanent.
Oh yeah, that is you were changing it up with that, Gabala. Siriki Tabakalam, Midabata, Siriki Tabakalam, Midabata. Shiva you be there, do Mashipa to Michipa Tabatam. Do my Shiva Yoba, and Nisawa Shiva you be new Kalabata, Midabasum, you be Anita, Tambo, Siriki, and in that Siriki with the Tabakalam, Midabate. Kade Shiva Yuna, Yutana, Chevaloba Juate, Kade many Tachuna, Pishin, Kidem, and Yemenguru, said that Hanjambagi, Da Pambo Kalambala, Yavan de Guji, Da Pambo Kalangamari, Koja da, any Koja Jena Ju Shiva Yubaki, Ransi Yimbe, Midubachi, Yawa Jumari. Sarah Midubachi and Metushena. That country, Shezhen Yanga, Nelas, Nishi Pambotangs, Yanga, Ribatan, Jiwutan, that's actually guilty, Nishi Pambotan. And Yanga, Ribatan, Jiwutan, Datu Deshin, Le Chamberche, turn out. And a do long job, but that day, she had to give us a cent or so.
So thus, next comes a rejection of the self as it's imagined by the Samkhya tradition. The Samkhya school of philosophy has multiple subdivisions, showing that it's unsuitable and incoherent to hold that a person which possesses consciousness could be permanent, and that's the first one here, showing that it's incoherent. You can't establish that a permanent person here is a word they use for the self or the soul, which is eternal, and the experiencer, observer of nature. So here to say that if the person has consciousness, then saying it's permanent is incoherent, and that's given in verse 235. The Samkhyas assert, if the self is asserted as matter, these inconsistencies apply, but since according to us the person's nature is to be conscious, there is not the least unwanted entailment. The attacks that have been given above, the arguments against the permanent self given above, don't apply to us. So then the answer to that is Samkhyas define 25 categories of phenomena, of which 24 are material, and the 25th is asserted as the knower, person, and self. These terms are used for it. They assert that the person experiences objects which the intellect makes it crave, causes it to crave. This is explained extensively elsewhere. Gyaltsab has done that elsewhere. And then in the verse here it says, if consciousness is permanent, an agent is superfluous. If fire is permanent, fuel is unnecessary.
Oh yeah. That didn't cut the Shiva diet, yet I said, cut the Yula long judge and Dashi Jew, right? Jew Shiva Yuba and Daba Kalena, I said, cut the Shiva Diana. And it's Shiva Jew, you said, and Yula long Jeba Cheba. Migambra, Mila saw a lover Jew a day, and it turned me about. Daba Kalena, turned me about Tas, Chibuloba Juates. Jew Yula long judge, Dabung or Yubis, Dabung or Yena, and it's out Titado and long job at that Google is oh, Mr. Miller saw a Yemela Madeba, Titado long Jugo is Jew Yula long judge, Dabung or Yubis. And you got it. Make you wish to fishing go Yena. Metabora Tuna fishing tell about Mijuana series. Got many Dajuna fishing tell Mijuro. So got a make you wish to fishing go Yena. Met to Yena and a make you to fishing go Maris. Many Tabajuna fishing tell about Mijuashino.
So then the reply to the Samkhyas continues. If the conscious person is asserted as permanent, it follows that agents such as the eyes and so forth, which permit experience of objects, are superfluous and useless, because the person experiences objects exists as a permanent functional thing or created thing, and thus it would be the eyes would be pointless because the person would always experience the objects in the absence of the eyes if it's a permanent thing. Fuel is needed to make a fire, but if fire were permanent, fuel would be unnecessary. There would be no need for the fuel to make it occur.
Oh yeah, that did it. You are sure you'll be saying. You must about to miss you, but Tawani. Then it's our Chishindu, Jibipadu Yome. Can I give you Sheba? Yoba makes it some memories. And a Kadi Juni Shiva you be, and you knew more. You'll launch about Boyina. Judy, you'll launch about Shiva you be new more, and you'll launch about Boyina. Shiva Yobani, you'll launch about any Chawade, Shiva, you'll launch about Chawayela. The day, Caseta, Mimana se Carcedo.
Nicolaso poi.
Mila so ide. Mila so che o mi va la mica ambola so che chabala te no metto sena. Ya. No, io metto sena. Sen. 等你告诉的，醒了说话，弄了醒了说话，弄了说话给就是没办法。弄个角色没办法，有一千万没啦；弄个角色有那有一千万，弄个角色没办法，有一千万没啦。就太大了，但呢，没些怕都要完了，明代为确认，你再了点把它要完你都，谁干了？人家的，在你千万七千都基本怕都要完没，
Next comes next comes a rejection, showing how the consequence, unacceptable consequence for the Samkhyas would obtain that if a substance which possesses a consciousness would have to be indestructible for as long as the person existed, as long as the person had not disintegrated, then a substance which possesses consciousness would necessarily have to endure and be not disintegrate for as long as the person existed. It was not disintegrating. So that's shown in verse 236. If consciousness is permanent, an agent is superfluous. If fire is, I'm sorry, it's 236. The person whose nature is potential. Sorry, yeah. The person whose nature is potential consciousness is the experiencer of objects, and being conscious is the activity of experiencing. Since this depends on agents like the eye, there is no flaw. That's what the Samkhya would assert. The reply to that is that right? 36. Yeah. Movement does not occur. Movement does not occur unless, for instance, a tree is agitated by the wind. But those fallacies would entail movement until the substantial entity disintegrates. The phenomenon of activity depends on the substantial entity, the substance which is being moved, and is motion. The activity is motion. So then the verse here says, a substantial entity, unlike an action, does not alter until it disintegrates. Thus it is improper to claim that the person exists, but consciousness does not.
他这个没得没白的啦，在你小娃起心多，你没法就要没谁的啦，在你有一小娃，在了单把汤，有一小娃的在了单把汤。 在没些榜样，就把其他我心头再让你没些榜样，就把其他我心头再让你见人，就别怕都要没吧，是吧？要没把人上，就别怕都要没是。提醒都希望要把汤，我别提醒都希望要把汤。 就我他没在北京，俺那大把人把天呐，有了老这边太阳，俺那9月了，希望没这希望没得早是
So then here the translation reads, the activity of moving depends on the substantial entity and may cease even though the substantial entity has not disintegrated. The nature of the substantial entity does not likewise change between its production and its disintegration. By contrast, consciousness and the person are an indifferentiable permanent entity, for the Samkhya position that is. Thus it is improper to claim that the person, but not consciousness, exists prior to experiencing an object.
他这里就我的写话啥话来，写话预备，你问我开了吧，没得把你。先都写话预备，看同时先都写预的，这就属于心态起就那么做入是。 我有了老教吧，给我的小娃儿吧，你没讲是，我的小娃儿吧，你没讲，小娃提给女娃儿呗是，有了老教吧，给我个小娃的，要把你没讲，小娃提给女娃儿呗，俺这9个月多些呐，是有了老教呗，哪个不来，先对小娃儿呗，俺这看牛吧。 同性，俺那现在老就比这小也把同的谁干了？哦， 先度写完月表看同学先度写月的，是为了long这边那个先度写完月表给写完月表看你话同学，先度样为了long这边写完月表同的，太大呢，假期学完你。学完你，其假期恐怖的学完，假期学完你，假期恐怖的学完，假如是路呢，假期学完你，其假期恐怖学完新度，我的写完月饼你话听你，其写完也把啥用我学完提起日子假期学你提起就哪把学完去了才的了写完啥用我就提起就哪把就他写完的就我记住安尼大写这个就安尼开朗不行我记住开朗不起来
Then next comes showing that it's incorrect and undemonstrable to hold the position that the Samkhya does, that says that the person previously exists, having the potential for consciousness prior to the appearance or the manifestation of that consciousness. This is given in verse 237. Here, the Samkhyas would assert, although there is no consciousness prior to experiencing objects, its potential and thus the person exists. Its potential exists and thus the person exists. The reply to that, at times one sees potential consciousness, at other times consciousness itself. Because of being like molten iron, the person undergoes change. On occasions other than when objects are being experienced, one sees potential consciousness, and when objects are being experienced, consciousness itself. In that case, like molten iron, which later becomes a solid mass, former potential consciousness later becomes actual consciousness. It therefore follows that the person undergoes change because consciousness and the person are accepted as a single thing, a single entity, or having the same character.
那就好了，那这他什么的叫日本先把大把的搞来了，日本先把大把大搞把的，他样实际你这个呢，那突然咱们这个一旦代表有些话搞把。大家都对我搞把你这边，那突然咱们是个一旦代表有些话搞把的了。是以怎么写了的？就那个新度写，提醒我你写完语你明得通，而且代表给国家给写完语比我妈的是干这是那昨天咱们是给一旦代表，你有写完要把你也是一旦代表给有写完要把你，一旦代表咱们写了淡的，一旦这呢太当有他们这个有他们的这个写完就结了是，就那个新度大把当吃吧，新度吃吧，印度先呐。
Now then, next comes a rejection of the self as it's imagined by the Nyayika school. Nyayikas, logicians, literally, or followers of Nyaya, of logic. So there's two parts to that. A rejection of the idea that the self possesses mind, which is merely atoms or particles of matter. That position, and that is what knows objects. A rejection of that, and then the rejection of the idea that the self is permanent. Self is pervasive, pervades everything. So the first is the rejection of the idea of the self is that it possesses intellect or mind, which is merely material or has composed of particles, and then that is what knows objects, a rejection of that. That's given in verse 13. The Nyayika assertion is that our person, and here I'm modifying the translation a bit, our person does not have a conscious character. Its character is not conscious. Since part of the self, the mere size of a particle, has mind, there is consciousness of objects. It depends on just this part with mind. A person that is conscious and not separate from mind is produced through this association. The person is permanent and as extensive as space, like space. The reply to that is merely a small part that has mind is conscious, but the person is vast as space. That's their position. Therefore, it would seem as though its nature is not to be conscious.
Oh yeah, she is a lassie. She is a shilla. They do not seem to that. That didn't cause it. Tasty tea or Nishawa using mental tone, said that. And the top of that cherry. Dog do Renzamji, Dog do Renzamji, Cho Shan, Shiva than draw meba, T series. Dog do Zenji Cho Shan, Shiva than draw meba T series. That tea only, you shall when you remember, Tishy tea only. That tea only, you shall ever remember that 20 days. Do Renzamji, Lenza than Treves. Do Renzamji, Lenza than Treves. 慷慨去连着的介绍些居民的百姓，除慷慨去连着的介绍些居民的百姓，希望也把明白得了，就开了把没人说。
So I think I mistranslated the actual title of this section. The Nyayikas are positing that the mind intellect is the size of a particle, whereas the self is pervasive and permanent. And so, since except for a part as small as a particle, the rest of this permanent and extensive self is not associated with consciousness, that self's nature does not seem to have consciousness of objects. So that would entail for them that their self doesn't know things other than the little bit of it, the particle of it that is associated with consciousness. Just as it cannot be said that the water of the Ganges is salty because of contact with a grain of salt, it is inappropriate to assert that that which is not consciousness, that which is not conscious, is the person or as the person.
Oh yeah, that's it. You are started to do a Gabanese. Kadukula Diana, Shenji teaching Armito, Tini, Tini, Dushi Chava Mideto, that's one I say, Hasare. And it's some young Gula relation and any Rarangita, Chashameba. Chashameba, some Regita, Chashameba, and the Tabatam. Nanga Shindu. 아니 난가 탐자를 쳐와나서 난가 시도 쳐비수도 아니原来교생진 다텔라 아니 교생진 다텔라 나제 미다고 냠도 점바타 다텔라 나제 미다고 냠도 점바타 다테니 주인不切가족을라 다연나 대라 현지 지금미도 세세는 야, 내가 대체 임베치리. 현지 당정기 요나 랑게단 맨나니. 현지 당정기 요나 랑게단 맨나니 안에 다들 탐자를 쳐왔다가 그래. 난가시도 쳐왔다가 그래. 현지 다 대니지 좀 현지 다 대니지 되는 미동 현나니 미동 현나니 나 테니지 테니라 주와 미대서라니 그라니라 주와 저 미대도스라 테니지니 테니라 주와 미대도스 나 테니지 테니라 주와 미대도스 주제 주지 이메위시로.
Next comes the rejection of their position, which holds that the self is permanent and all-pervasive, omnipresent, pervasive, and that's given in verse 239. So here the verse starts off by saying, if the self is in everyone, then why does another not think of this one as I? It is unacceptable to say that it is obscured by itself. If there is a partless permanent self, which is omnipresent like space and in each individual sentient being, why would another person not think I in relation to my own self? Okay. I'm sorry. It follows that they should think of it as I. When they see another person, they would think I. It follows that they should think of it as I because the two selves are one. It cannot be omnipresent if the object of someone else's conception of the self is not my own self. It would not be omnipresent. And then they come back and say, the Samkhya's come back and say, it is not perceived because it has been obscured by the other's self. And then the response to that, it is unacceptable to say that the self obscures itself, for there is no duality of that which obscures and that which is obscured. That which is obscures and that which is obscured would be identical. There's no difference between them.
Oh, yeah. 他快来说，都前面做钱，我也他大个原点搞不的，大个原点搞不现在把他了什么月饼拿呢？他做潘不阳赢了，他这就吃饱不？潘不阳赢了，他这就吃饱开两把，两把他冲把你是，看个原点吃饱的，那么个些马赢吧，他到他呢两把来，吃饱这样原马赢是，哦呀。 terwa changchen bagi ane kare sana da dedu tanyum sum chanyen bi zo pambo tela ane loam chembo pambo la loam chembo migi namra ane chembo shawa de chungla loam chembo tele ngaja sum jungsin yindu jing ngaja la ane le ambo nga dang leji ambo nga 이제 아무것도 아니 죽지 총어 다더니 인도진 가자 누진 가자래 아니 수라서 태zam가다 대래 중앙가 총어 membajanji ngajani ngajani ki jukse ino sesero 장전바 강게 따나 다들이 장전바 강게디 제자님아 개념다지 장전바 강게 되나 연대수 찬양비 연대수 안에 가서로 찬양비做的 남주 타다기 제법보탕 강게 연대 제법탕 세세 남주 타다기 제법보탕 나바군도 시와 여바 마인바 개랑바 개량바 가와타세 남그 시에 마인바 세요 나바군도 시와 여바 여바 마인바 개랑바다 가와타 대다게 나바군도 시와 여바 개마량바 개량바 대다니 시와 치지로도 내위 년바라 제바 지양 여바 마인부 세를
Next comes rejection of the Samkhya position again, where it says that showing that other refutations of their ideas of the self, the qualities of the self, and so forth, that has multiple subdivisions here. The first is that their position, which holds that here the technical term is what do you call it? The principle. She has it as principle, which is not, which is, although it is material, is the creator of everything. Their position that holds that this principle is like the material nature which produces all of the phenomena of the world and everything except for the person, which is not not identical with the person, not part of the principle here, chito or pradana. In Sanskrit. So anyway, this their view, that their position that this principle, which is material, is the creator of everything, is similar to madness. So here the Samkhya assertion is that the Great One, a synonym for the intellect, evolves from the principle, which is like nature, giving rise, which is material, and from that nature or principle, which is material, then the Great One, or is another name for the intellect, develops from that, and a balance of pleasure, pain, and equanimity. So the principle is called is said to be, in the Samkhya tradition, have pleasure, pain, and equanimity as sort of balanced within it. The 3 I principles evolve from the Great One. 11 faculties evolve from the I principle associated with lightness. 5 mental faculties, 5 faculties for action, and the speculative faculty, that's the way she's given it. And from the I principle associated with motility comes the 5 mere objects, the elements, from which the 5 elements evolve. The I principle of darkness acts as the basis for the other 2 I principles. This is a sketch of the Samkhya scheme of 24 components of reality that are composed within generally within the principle or pradhana, and then the 25th is the person or self. So in the verse here, there's no difference between the insane and those for whom the attributes are the creator but are never conscious. It follows that it is contradictory to assert, as do the Samkhyas, that the principle, which is a balance of the 3 attributes, is the creator of all manifestations but is never conscious. There is not the least difference between those who assert the like and the insane whose perception is distorted. Stop there for now.